All right, guys, today let's talk a little bit about pick handles. In the past, what I've usually done is just take my commercial picks, and then I take some marine grade shrink tubing, which has that adhesive on the inside of it, and it's also a lot thicker material. And then I just melt it onto the pick handles, and this is kind of what I've ended up with. And my personal color coding, I use black for 25 thousandths, or in this case, this is a Praxis pick, so this is 23 thousandths, close enough. And then for the thinner 15,000 stuff, I use blue handles. Makes it easier for me to keep track. So that's what I've done in the past. For my last birthday, my wife gave me a rat yoke, and then she gave me another rat yoke for Christmas. And these really have turned into some of my favorite picks. Very nice. Each of these truly is a work of art. You guys seen me talk about these things before. They are just stunning. But two things about them. They're $120 each, so that's a big hurdle, at least for me. Some of you guys are rolling in cash, but I'm not one of you. The other thing is, because of the cost, I'm really nervous about pulling these things out and using them in any locks. So to have such a nice pick, something that feels so nice in my hand, very ergonomic, nice dense material, to have such a nice pick and be afraid to pick it up, it's kind of a shame. So I decided to take a look at some other picks, at some other handle materials. Now here's another one. This is one that I have built. I've made it, and I'm going to show you how to make this thing in just a minute. It's very similar to the rat yoke, but it is not a work of art. There are some little defects on here. I didn't spend a lot of time, the entire time, not counting the epoxy drying time. I got between 20 and 30 minutes in this thing. That's it. But in terms of heft, it's about the same as the rat yoke. It's dimensionally, it's almost the same as the rat yoke, except instead of $120, this one cost about $4. And of course, 20 or 30 minutes of my time. That's what I want to talk about. So the day that, all picks break. And the day that this one breaks, I won't feel very bad at all. Whereas when the day the rat yoke breaks, I'm going to be super depressed. And I really want to put that off as long as possible. And the way I'm going to do that is over time, convert all of my picks to this type of handle. So let me show you how I'm going to do that. I've been experimenting. I've gone through some learning curves. And I'll tell you right up front, you're going to need a hacksaw. You're going to need some sandpaper and steel wool to do the polishing of the handles. You're going to need a tube of epoxy. And you're going to need some micarta. Now, micarta is available, obviously, on eBay, like everything else I buy. Micarta comes in a variety of different colors. Pretty much any color you want, you can get it. And they sell them in pairs, and these are called scales. And they're sold to knife makers, one side or one scale for each side of the handle. In terms of what we're going to use them for, we're going to use each of these scales to sandwich our pick. Of course, we're going to have to use a hacksaw to cut these things to the right size, but that's pretty much what we're going to do. We're going to epoxy it, and we're going to finish it. I'm going to show you how to do that. Some of the lessons I did learn is I initially bought these guys on top here. I bought a pair of scales, and this sells for $6 mailed to your door. Here's a couple of blue ones. Now, the difference here is this is called paper micarta, and that's what I used for my prototype. Worked out really nice. And then there's something called canvas micarta, which gives you a slightly different texture. You really can't see it too well in the blue here, but it really shows up in this olive drab one. You can see it's a variety of different colors in there. I think it's focusing now. When you look at the side of it, you can see layers of canvas in there. Gives you a slightly rougher finish, but I think this really does look good when you get it finished on your pick handles. One thing I did notice, $6 for the paper micarta for a pair of scales, $7 for a pair of the canvas scales. You'll notice that these are a little bit different. These sell for the same price, $7, but they're smaller. These are enough for 4 picks. This is only enough for 2 picks. So be very careful when you order these. Pay attention to the dimensions when you order your scales. The other thing is thickness. It comes in basically 3 thicknesses that might be useful to us. It comes in 1/4 inch thickness. This one is 3/16 thickness, so 1/16 of an inch less. And what I found, though, is when I sandwich a pick inside of here, it's awful thick for a pick handle. And so I bought and finally settled on 1/8 inch, and that's what you see here. This cell's a little bit different. It comes in sheets. Here's a brown one, I got a black one, and then a 12 inch by 12 inch blue one for my 15 thousandths. 1/8 of an inch is just about right because we get 2 of these plus the thickness of the pick. It's going to be identical in thickness to the rat yoke when we finally get it all glued up and sanded down. It's going to come out dimensionally almost exactly like this. So let's talk about how to begin this. Here is a brown one. And for this video, here's what I'm going to do. Brown is not one of my normal colors. And these are made by Rare Elements. These are all 10 thousandths of an inch, but you see he put blue handles, which is kind of messes me up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is declare brown is now the color for 10 thousandths, and I'm going to put brown Micarta handles on all of these Rare Elements picks, which you guys see me using all the time. So what I do first, well, you need to put etching on here so you can begin to cut. Now when you look at this, you'll notice, let me see if I can hold it up here a little closer to the camera lens. It's a little bit thicker than the pick itself. And that's because the thickness of the saw blade is going to remove some of that material. And the other thing, when you clamp this in the vise and you use your hacksaw, be very, very careful to keep it exactly on that line. If you just start sawing away at high speed, it'll start to veer off in one direction or another. So by making this a little bit wider than the width of my pick, it's going to leave a little bit of fat on both sides of it so that it'll allow me to sand it and it'll come out perfectly flush on the top. So let me go and cut these up and get them cut to size, and we'll come back and I'll show you the next step. All right, guys, that 1 6x12 gave me a lot more of this material than I needed, but my picks are going to eventually break, so these will be extras that I can build up some new picks later. I've cut these to length, and there's a couple things we want to do beforehand. First of all, don't wait until after your pick's together to finish it. So if you like to have a highly buffed, very reflective finish, now's the time to do it. And I would only do it up to about right there. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just polish that so that the part sticking out will be mirror-like. I'm not going to do it because I really don't care. I'm looking at functionality here. All right, when we put these on here, you'll notice that there's plenty of fat around the edges. So I'm going to position that just about like that. And then we're going to epoxy the other piece right on top. And the thing that you'll notice when we get this together, if we epoxy this now, the front of this is going to be very difficult to get sandpaper without messing up the finish on the pick. So instead of waiting until then, let's do it before we epoxy it. So finish your pick beforehand, and let's also finish these beforehand. And the way I've discovered to do it, the best way to do it, is pair them up, take a piece of duct tape and stick it on there, and then you can match these up both in length, and you can sand them down and get a perfectly beveled edge on the front. Then we'll epoxy it, and then we can worry about the other 3 edges. So let me go ahead and pair all these up. Let me finish the front of all of them, and we'll come back to the next step. All right, that's kind of what we're after. It's kind of semi-finished there. It'll look a lot nicer when I hit it with a little bit more steel wool and polish it up and take a couple of little rough edges off. All right, once you're done doing that and you're happy, go ahead and check and make sure, just take one of your picks and position it. And so when we're done, it's going to kind of look like that. We still have to finish the rest of this, but before we do that, we really need to sandwich these and epoxy them together. Before you apply your epoxy, though, take your flats, go ahead and put them face down on a piece of sandpaper and rough them up. You want to remove all this shiny stuff from the inside where the epoxy is going to be. We really want to give it every chance to get a good solid bond. When you're done with that, take rubbing alcohol and wipe it to remove all that fine dust. And at the same time, use some rubbing alcohol to remove any oil residue that might be on the pick. Once you're done with that, go ahead and apply your epoxy, put your picks inside of there, and clamp them up. Compress them with a pair of vice grips or put them into your vise. Before you do that, though, make sure that the front of these are lined up as perfectly as you can get them. If you don't pay attention like I did and one of them slides a little bit forward, you've kind of wasted your time. So get it as perfect as you can now before that epoxy cures. That's a little too far. I'm going to slide them up a little bit more, right about there. Plenty of room. All right. See you in 24 hours. All right, guys, a full 24 hours has passed. I know this glue is supposed to fully set up in about an hour, but I found that when I compress it in a vise like we did, it doesn't always cure on the inside. So if you give 24 hours, you can be sure that when we start sanding this, the grips aren't going to come flying off. This is a mess. You see we have epoxy kind of leaked out. Got my fingerprints all over it. It's oozing out on the cracks. But that's all okay, because now we're going to finish these other 3 sides. There's a couple of ways we can do this. If you're lucky enough to have a rotary disc sander or a belt sander, you can pretty much make quick work of this. Just place it flat on it, sand it down to the metal, flip it over, of course, and then roll it around like that to get the edge rounded to fit the back of the pick. I'm going to use flat sandpaper mounted on basically a floor tile, piece of marble, put the sandpaper on top of it, and then I'm going to just sand it back and forth. It takes a little bit longer, but I found it gives me a little bit better control. I usually start out with 120 grit because that takes the material off pretty quickly, and then move all the way up to 600 grit when I get down to the metal. And the 600 actually will start to polish the metal, gives it a really nice finish. I'll take it and put a band and then rotate it back and forth just like we refinish our picks to get the rounded edge on the top and the bottom. And I'll also clean up the back of this just like we did on the front there. When I've got everything rounded off and kind of the way I want it to look, then I'll take a piece of steel wool. I like to use 00, but if you really like a really high gloss finish, you can use a 40, and that ought to give you a really nice finish on these things. So let me go ahead and undo all that stuff and get these done, come back and give you a look at what I came up with. All right, guys, about 2 hours has passed since I started sanding on these things. A lot of that time was spent, I did the sanding outside, so a lot of time was spent moving back and forth inside and outside, and also setting up the camera to get some B-roll to show you guys kind of what I was doing. I ended up starting out with 80 grit sandpaper to get the overall shape, so that seemed to work out better for me. Although with 80 grit, as you can see on this one, it's very easy to take off too much like I did right there. But other than that, I think this is probably the worst one. That's not quite perfect. It's not a work of art. I'll be the first to admit it. A couple of these, I got a glob of glue hanging out there in the front. Other than that, this one came out pretty good. Even the backs of these, it really doesn't take as much work as I thought. Now, this was probably the worst one. A bunch of glue smeared out there on the end, a place right there where I didn't quite spend enough time with the fine sandpaper to take that scratch out. And even though I warned you guys about getting the tips, the ends of them straight, you can see this one here is a little higher. I didn't pay enough attention, but other than that, it looked pretty good. I even touched up the tips since I had the 600. That's what I finished up, 600 grit, and then I kind of polished them up. They came out really nice with 00 steel wool. I think if you had 40, they'd probably be almost mirror-like. I did, with 600 grit, kind of polish these up just a little bit. I didn't want to have ugly tips with what I consider to be pretty nice handles. And they did. They came out pretty nice. I spent about, well, like I said, it took about 2 hours, but I've only got between 20 and 25 minutes in each of these picks. So when the day comes, when one of these guys breaks, I'm not going to feel nearly as bad as if I break one of these. This is a work of art. This is not. Anyway, guys, I do appreciate your time. It's really easy to make these. If you're thinking about tips, think seriously about trying some of this Micarta stuff. It looks good, it's easy to work with, and it's pretty cheap, too. Anyway, guys, appreciate your time. Stay safe. Stay legal. If you like the idea of growing the Locksport community, please consider supporting the Lock Lab by either becoming a Patreon or clicking the join button below.